The cold came first, then the hunger, then the anger. In Petrograd, the winter did not loosen its grip. It settled into the streets, into the buildings, into the bones. Bread grew scarce, the queues grew longer. And each morning before the light had fully returned, women stepped out into the dark, not knowing if there would be anything left by the time they reached the front. We have 2 rooms, one where we sleep, cook, and live, another that I rent to a machinist named Grigory Ivanovich Volkov, who works nights at the Ericsson telephone plant. He is perhaps 45, a widower with grown children somewhere in the provinces, and he pays his rent on time in increasingly worthless rubles. The walls between our rooms are thin enough that I can hear him cough in his sleep, hear him dress in the dark before his shift, hear the creak of his bed when he cannot sleep at all. He can probably hear my children cry. He can certainly hear me walking the floors at night when the worry will not let me rest. The apartment itself is typical for our district, high ceilings from another era when these buildings housed merchants and clerks, now subdivided and overcrowded. The windows are large but single-paned, and in winter the cold seeps through invisible cracks, pooling on the floor like water. We stuff rags in the gaps, but it never seems enough. The stove in the corner is cast iron, older than me, temperamental. When there is coal, which lately there has not been, it heats the main room adequately. The bedroom stays cold. We sleep together, the 3 of us, under every blanket and coat we own. February in Petrograd is not merely cold, it is a cold that has intent, that knows you personally, that seeks you out. It is a cold that creeps under your clothes no matter how many layers you wear, that makes your fingers ache, that turns your breath to ice on your scarf. This winter, though, the cold felt different. It felt like punishment, like the city itself was turning against us. I work at the Samsonevsky textile mill, 8 kopecks a day when there is work, which lately there has not been. The mill stands like a gray fortress along the Neva, 4 stories of brick and iron and broken dreams. It employs, or employed before the cutbacks, nearly 2,000 women. We work the looms, the spinning machines, the dye vats. The air inside is thick with cotton dust that coats your lungs and never quite washes out. You can always tell a textile worker by her cough, but at least when the machines are running, the mill is warm. The friction, the steam, the press of bodies, it all generates heat. Outside, the wind comes off the frozen river like a knife drawn across exposed skin. On the morning of January 28th, I remember the date because it was Masha's name day, though we had nothing to celebrate with, I woke before dawn to join the bread queue. This had become my routine, as fixed as prayer for those who still believed in such things. Wake at 4, dress in darkness so as not to disturb the children, wrap my shawl twice around my head, button my coat to the throat, and walk the 6 blocks to the bakery on Bolshoi Prospect. If you arrived any later than 5 o'clock, you would not get bread. Sometimes you did not get bread anyway. I moved through the apartment by touch and memory. The stove was cold. We had burned the last of our coal the day before. I pulled on my boots, cracked and leaking at the seams, and laced them by feel. Through the thin wall, I could hear Grigory Ivanovich breathing in his sleep, a rattling sound that spoke of too many years breathing factory air. In the bedroom, Masha and Pyotr were curled together like kittens, their faces barely visible in the darkness. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. They looked peaceful. I did not want to wake them into another day of hunger. The stairwell was dark and smelled of cabbage, urine, and despair. I descended carefully, one hand on the wall, my footsteps echoing. On the second floor, I passed old Madame Kuznetsova struggling with her door. She was 70 if she was a day, bent like a question mark, her hands twisted with arthritis. "Elena Petrovna," she whispered, "are you going for bread?" "Yes, babushka." "If there is any, if you could." I nodded, though I knew there would not be enough. There was never enough. Outside, the cold hit like a fist. The sky was still full of dark, the street lamps casting weak yellow circles on the snow. The snow itself was not fresh and clean, but gray, trampled, mixed with ash and horse dung and the general filth of a city under siege by winter. I pulled my shawl tighter and began walking. The streets at that hour belonged to the desperate, women going to bread queues, night workers heading home, prostitutes finishing their shifts, the occasional drunk staggering between shadows. A police officer stood on the corner of Simbirskaya Street, stamping his feet against the cold, his breath clouding white. He watched me pass but said nothing. What was there to say? I was just another woman going to join another queue. The queue at the bakery on Bolshoi Prospect was already substantial when I arrived. 40 women, perhaps 50, stretched around the corner into the side street. I took my place behind a woman I recognized from the building next to mine, Vera Nikolaevna, a laundress with 3 children and a husband at the front. Her face was pinched with cold, and something deeper than cold. We nodded to each other but did not speak at first. Speaking used energy, and energy was a currency we could no longer afford to spend carelessly. The sky began to lighten by slow degrees, black fading to dark gray, then to the pale gray that passed for daylight in Petrograd's winter. A tram clattered past on Samsonievsky Prospect, its bell ringing, nearly empty. 3 soldiers rode in the back, their faces gray with exhaustion. One of them looked at our queue and looked away quickly, as though ashamed. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle blew, the first shift starting at the metalworks. The city was waking up, reluctant and cold. The queue shuffled forward by inches. Women stamped their feet, blew on their hands, pulled their shawls tighter. A few talked in low voices. "They say a train was derailed near Moscow. Sabotage. Everything is sabotage now, or incompetence. Hard to tell the difference. My sister in Tula writes that they have nothing at all. At least you get letters. I haven't heard from my husband since November." I listened but did not join in. What was there to say? We all knew the situation. The war, our great patriotic war against Germany and Austria, had been grinding on for nearly 3 years now, consuming men and metal and grain with the appetite of some ancient god that could never be satisfied. The trains that once brought flour and potatoes to the city now carried ammunition to the front. The men who once baked bread now dug trenches or lay dead in them. The factories that once made textiles now made uniforms and bandages. And we, the women left behind, stood in queues before dawn and waited for bread that might not come. Vera finally spoke, her voice flat and exhausted. "They say the shipment was delayed again. They always say that. This time it might be true. The railways are in chaos. Nothing moves anymore except soldiers and shells. Even the soldiers sometimes don't move. They freeze to death in their trains, waiting at sidings." I had heard this too. Everyone had heard everything. Petrograd ran on rumors the way it once ran on coal and electricity. You could not trust any of them, but you could not ignore them either. They were all we had. "How are your children?" I asked. Vera's mouth tightened. Hungry, like everyone's children. Sonia, my youngest, she's developed a cough. I don't have money for a doctor. I don't think the doctor would come anyway. He has too many patients, all of them dying of hunger or cold or both. Pyotr has a cough too. We stood in silence for a while, sharing the unspoken understanding of mothers watching their children suffer and being powerless to stop it. By 7 o'clock, the bakery still had not opened. The crowd had grown restless. Women near the front began pounding on the door, their fists making dull thumps against the wood. A policeman appeared, the same one I had seen on the corner earlier, fat-faced and irritable, his mustache crusted with frost. He looked at us with the expression of a man who knew he was hated and had stopped caring. "Disperse!" he shouted. "There's no bread today." "When will there be bread?" someone yelled back. "How should I know? I'm not the Tsar. Go home." A murmur rippled through the queue, not quite anger yet, but something close to it, something that could tip either way. The policeman shifted his weight from foot to foot, his hand moving instinctively to the truncheon at his belt. We stared at him. He stared back. For a long moment, nothing happened. The tension hung in the air like smoke. Then Vera spat at his feet, not at him directly, but close enough that the meaning was clear, and turned away. The gesture broke the spell. Women began drifting away from the queue, muttering, their faces dark with frustration. I stood there a moment longer, staring at the closed bakery door, at the policeman, at the gray sky above. Then I turned and walked home with Vera. We did not speak much on the walk back. What was there to say? This had happened before. It would happen again. The city was running out of everything except cold and despair. When we reached her building, Vera stopped and touched my arm. "Elena Petrovna, if you hear of any work, anything at all, will you let me know? The laundry has cut my hours. I don't know how we'll manage." "I will. And if you hear anything—" She nodded. We understood each other. We were all balancing on the same knife's edge. When I reached my building, I found Masha standing at the window of our apartment, her small face pressed against the glass, watching for me. Her face brightened when she saw me on the street below, then fell when she saw my empty hands. By the time I climbed the 4 flights of stairs, she was standing in the doorway, trying not to cry. "No bread, little one," I said, pulling her into an embrace. "But we still have kasha." We had kasha because 3 days earlier I had traded my second shawl, the good one, the one my mother had given me when I married, to a woman from Vasilyevsky Island for a small bag of buckwheat. The buckwheat would last perhaps a week if we were careful, less if the children's hunger got the better of them. After that, I did not know. I tried not to think about it. Thinking about it made my chest tight and my hands shake. Pyotr was still asleep in the bedroom, curled in a nest of blankets. His face was flushed, his breathing slightly labored. I put my hand on his forehead. Warm, but not feverish. Not yet. I let him sleep. I made kasha for breakfast, boiling the buckwheat in water with a pinch of salt. We had no butter, no milk, no sugar. The kasha was gray and bland, but it was food. Masha ate hers slowly, making it last, her eyes serious. She had learned not to ask for more. "Mama," she said quietly, "will Papa come home soon?" My husband, Ivan Maximovich, was somewhere on the German front, if he was still alive. I had not heard from him since December. The letter had been brief, the handwriting shaky, the words chosen carefully to avoid the military censors. "We are well. The fighting continues. I think of you and the children. I pray we will see each other soon. Standard phrases that told me nothing except that he had been alive on the day he wrote them. I don't know, little dove, I said. I hope so. Do you think he's cold? I thought of the stories we heard, soldiers freezing in trenches, their boots frozen to their feet, their rations stolen or lost or simply never sent. I thought of the hospital trains that arrived at the Finland station, packed with men who had lost limbs, lost minds, lost any resemblance to the men who had marched away 3 years earlier. I think he's managing, I said. Your papa is strong. After breakfast, I left Masha to watch Pyotr and walk to the mill. The streets were more crowded now, full of workers heading to the factories, women returning from unsuccessful trips to the market, children playing in the gray snow. The sun had risen, but it was a weak, watery thing that gave light without warmth. The mill loomed ahead, its brick walls blackened with soot, its windows blank and dark. I joined the stream of women flowing through the gates, showed my worker's card to the guard, an old man missing 3 fingers on his left hand, too injured to work the machines, but still useful for watching doors, and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor where the looms were kept. The floor supervisor, a narrow man named Kuskov with a face like a hatchet, was waiting at the top of the stairs. He held a clipboard and wore an expression of permanent irritation. "Attention!" he called out as we gathered. "Production is being cut again. Half the looms will shut down until further notice. Those of you who remain will work 6-hour shifts instead of 8. Wages will be adjusted accordingly." A murmur of protest rose from the crowd of women. "Adjusted how?" someone called out. "Reduced proportionally to reflect the reduced hours." "But the prices keep rising. How are we supposed to live?" Kuskov shrugged. "Take it up with the Tsar. I don't set policy. I just enforce it." The mention of the Tsar drew bitter laughs. Nicholas II, our little father, our divine ruler, was somewhere far away in his palaces, making decisions that destroyed us while he remained comfortable and warm. He might as well have been on the moon for all the good his rule did us. I learned that I was among those being kept on, small mercy. Others, women I had worked beside for years, were told to go home and wait to be called back. Their faces showed what they thought of their chances. The shift that day was brutal despite being shorter. We worked fewer looms, which meant each of us had to move faster, work harder. The machines clattered and roared, the cotton dust hung in the air like fog, and by the end of 6 hours my back ached and my hands were raw. Kuskov stalked the aisles, shouting at anyone who slowed down, his clipboard clutched like a weapon. During the brief break we were given, 10 minutes to use the toilet, drink water from the communal bucket, catch our breath, I stood with a woman named Klavdia Sergeyevna, who worked the loom next to mine. She was younger than me, perhaps 27, with strong hands and fierce eyes. "This can't continue," she said, her voice low. "They keep cutting our hours, cutting our pay, and the price of bread keeps rising. Meanwhile, the owners—" She gestured toward the offices on the 4th floor, where the factory managers worked in heated rooms with real desks and real chairs. "They're not suffering." "What can we do?" "Strike," she said simply. "Refuse to work until they meet our demands. They'll just replace us. With who? Every factory in Petrograd is short of workers. The men are all at the front. They need us more than we need them." She smiled grimly. "They just don't know it yet." I said nothing, but her words stayed with me through the rest of the shift. On my way home, I stopped at the market on Simbirskaya Street. The market was a sad shadow of what it had been even a year ago. A few stalls remained open, but their offerings were pitiful. Some withered potatoes, their eyes sprouting, a basket of turnips half of them rotten. A piece of meat that looked like it might have come from a horse, gray and gristly. A handful of frozen apples, their skins wrinkled and brown. The vendors stood behind their goods with hard eyes, knowing they had what we needed, knowing we had no choice but to pay. I looked at the potatoes. How much? 3 rubles for 6. 3 rubles. A month ago, that would have bought 30 potatoes. I had 4 rubles in my pocket, my entire week's wages. I bought 2 potatoes and went home. Grigory Ivanovich was awake when I returned, sitting at the small table we shared, drinking tea without sugar or milk. Just hot water, really, colored brown by reused leaves. He was a quiet man, older than me by perhaps 15 years, with gray hair and a face that had settled into permanent weariness. His wife had died of cholera 5 years earlier. His children, 2 sons and a daughter, had moved to Yaroslavl to work in a munitions factory. He never spoke of them, and I never asked. "Any news from the factory?" I asked, setting the potatoes on the table. He shrugged. "Strikes, always strikes these days. The metal workers at the Putilov plant walked out yesterday. They're demanding higher wages, an 8-hour day, better treatment from the foreman. The management refused, so they shut down the entire plant. 20,000 men just stopped working." "Will the government intervene?" "The government." He laughed, a dry sound. "The government is busy losing a war. They don't have time for labor disputes. They'll probably send in the Cossacks eventually, crack some heads, arrest some ringleaders. Same as always." "And the war?" "Still happening." He sipped his tea. "They say we're winning. They've been saying that for 3 years. Meanwhile, boys keep dying and nothing changes." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the building. Footsteps overhead, a baby crying somewhere below, the creak and groan of old wood settling in the cold. "Elena Petrovna," Grigory said finally, "how much longer do you think we can go on like this?" It was a question I had been avoiding, but now it hung between us, unavoidable. "I don't know," I said. "As long as we have to, I suppose." He nodded slowly. "People can endure a great deal, but there's a limit, even for Russians." That night, after the children were asleep, after I had fed them kasha and the 2 potatoes, boiled and divided, and after I had told them a story about a princess and a firebird that I barely remembered from my own childhood, I sat by the window and looked out over the city. Petrograd spread away in all directions under a sky the color of ash. Smoke rose from 1,000 chimneys, lit from below by the occasional street lamp or factory light. The frozen Neva cut through it all like a scar, its surface a pale gray in the darkness. Somewhere out there, in palaces and government offices, men in warm rooms made decisions that shaped our lives. They decided whether we would have bread, whether our husbands would come home, whether our children would live or die. We were numbers to them, statistics, labor units to be deployed or discarded as needed. But we were not numbers. We were people. We were mothers and wives and daughters. We had names. We had lives. We mattered. I did not know then, sitting at that window on that cold January night, how close we were to the edge. How close the entire city was to the moment when patience would run out, when hunger would turn to fury, when the women in the bread queues would stop accepting no for an answer. But I could feel something building, like pressure in the air before a storm, like ice cracking on a river in spring. Something was coming. We just didn't know what yet. The morning of February 23rd began like any other morning, which is to say, badly. I woke to darkness and the sound of Pyotr coughing, a wet, rattling cough that had started 2 days earlier and refused to stop. I lit the lamp with shaking hands, my fingers clumsy with cold and fear, and looked at him in the weak yellow light. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy. When I placed my hand on his forehead, his skin was hot to the touch. Not dangerously so. I had seen fever before, knew the difference between a cold and something worse, but enough to worry me. Enough to add another weight to the pile of worries I carried. I gave him the last of our honey dissolved in hot water. The honey had cost me a scarf, traded to a Georgian woman at the market 3 weeks ago, and I had been hoarding it for exactly this situation. Pyotr drank it slowly, his small throat working, his eyes never leaving my face. "It hurts," he whispered, touching his chest. "I know, little one. The honey will help. You need to rest." Masha was already awake, sitting up in the nest of blankets, watching us with those serious eyes that made her seem older than 8. She had learned over these hungry months to be quiet when Pyotr was sick, to make herself small and undemanding. "Masha," I said, "I need to go to the bread queue. Can you watch your brother for me? If his fever gets worse, go get Grigory Ivanovich." She nodded solemnly. "I will, Mama." I kissed them both, Pyotr's forehead burning against my lips, Masha's cheek cold, and prepared to leave. It was Thursday, and Thursday meant the bread queue on Nevsky Prospect, where the bakeries were larger and supposedly better supplied. It would be a longer walk, nearly 40 minutes each way, but the chance of actually getting bread was higher. Worth the effort, I calculated. Worth the risk. I dressed in layers, my shift, my house dress, my work dress over that, my coat buttoned to the throat, my shawl wrapped twice around my head, my cracked boots laced tight. Outside, the cold would be waiting. The cold was always waiting. I left the apartment at 4:30 and descended the dark stairwell. Old Madame Kuznetsova was not at her door this morning. Too cold, probably, or too weak, or too discouraged to try. I made a mental note to check on her later, if there was later, if I had energy for anything beyond survival. The streets were quieter than usual. Fewer people heading to work, fewer lights in windows. The city felt like it was holding its breath. I walked south toward the Neva, then west along the embankment. The river was still frozen solid, a vast white plain stretching between the dark buildings on either side. A few early workers trudged across it, taking the shortcut to the Admiralty side. I stayed on the street. The ice was treacherous this time of year, and falling through would mean death. Quick if you were lucky, slow if you were not. By the time I reached Nevsky Prospect, the sky was beginning to lighten. Nevsky, the great central avenue of Petrograd, the spine of the city, stretched before me like a stage waiting for actors. In better times, this street had been magnificent. Wide sidewalks lined with shops and cafes, street lamps like iron flowers, well-dressed people promenading in the evenings. Now the shops were mostly shuttered, the cafes dark, the sidewalks filled with queues instead of strollers. The bread queue stretched back from the bakery for blocks. 200 women, perhaps more, standing in the gray morning light, stamping their feet, blowing on their hands, waiting. But there was something different about them this morning. They were talking. Not the exhausted murmuring of previous days, but actual conversation, animated, purposeful, charged with something I could not quite identify. I took my place at the end of the queue, behind a group of factory women wearing the kerchiefs that marked them as textile workers from the Viborg side. They were young, most of them, younger than me, and they spoke with the kind of energy that comes before you've learned to conserve it. Today of all days, they expect us to just stand here forever. Enough is enough. The woman directly in front of me turned. She was perhaps 25, with a strong jaw and fierce eyes. Her coat was held together with twine and hope. "Do you know what day it is?" she asked. "Thursday." She smiled. "International Women's Day." I had heard of this, vaguely. A socialist holiday, something to do with workers' rights and women's suffrage. It had never meant much to me before. Holidays were for people with enough bread to celebrate. But as I listened to the women around me, I began to understand that today, for them, it meant something. It meant recognition. It meant solidarity. It meant a day to demand not just bread, but respect, rights, dignity. The queue inched forward as the sky grew lighter. The women kept talking, their voices rising, feeding off each other's energy. "We work 12 hours a day and can't afford to feed our children. Our husbands are dying at the front for what? For the Tsar's glory? For land we'll never see? While the rich stuff themselves, we starve. It's not right. It's not right, and we shouldn't accept it anymore." I listened but said little. I was tired. Tired of struggling, tired of worrying, tired of watching my children go to bed hungry night after night. Part of me wanted to tell these young women that talking changed nothing, that we had all complained before and nothing had improved. But another part of me, a part I had thought dead, stirred at their words. Yes, I thought. Yes, it's not right. By 7 o'clock, the bakery opened. But almost immediately it became clear that there would not be enough bread. The baker, a round-faced man whose prosperity offended us by its mere existence, came to the door and announced, "Only 50 loaves today. The shipment was delayed." 50 loaves for 200 women. The crowd erupted, not violently, not yet, but with a roar of frustration that seemed to come from all of us at once. Women surged forward, voices rose. "This is unacceptable. We've been waiting for hours. What are we supposed to feed our children?" The baker retreated inside and locked the door. The women at the front pounded on it, their fists making a sound like thunder. I stood in the middle of the crowd, feeling it pulse around me like a living thing. And then someone shouted, "Let's march." It happened so fast. One moment we were a bread queue, disorganized and angry but still contained. The next moment we were a march, flowing down Nevsky Prospect toward the center of the city. I found myself swept along, no longer making a conscious choice to participate, but simply moving with the current. "Bread!" someone shouted. "Bread!" the crowd answered. The word became a chant, a rhythm that matched our footsteps. Bread, bread, bread. We marched past shuttered shops, past policemen who watched with uncertain faces, past trams that slowed and stopped, their drivers staring. More women joined us at every corner. They emerged from side streets, from courtyards, from their own failed bread queues. The march grew. By the time we crossed the Litani Bridge back onto the Viborg side, there must have been thousands of us. I had never seen so many women in one place, all moving together, all sharing the same fury. "Down with hunger!" someone shouted. "Down with the war! Down with the autocracy!" The slogans multiplied, grew bolder. This was no longer just about bread. It was about everything: the war, the government, the entire system that ground us down day after day while the rich and powerful remained comfortable. We marched down Samsonievsky Prospect, past my own building. I looked up and saw Grigory Ivanovich standing at the window, watching. He raised a hand, not quite a wave, but an acknowledgement, a gesture of solidarity. I felt a surge of emotion I could not name. The factories loomed ahead, Ericsson, Ivaz, the metalworks, the chemical plants. As we approached, workers poured out to join us. Men this time, thousands of them, streaming from the factory gates with their caps and rough coats and work-worn hands. The march doubled in size, then tripled. I found myself marching next to a machinist from the Ericsson plant, a burly man with grease-stained hands and kind eyes. "About time," he said, gesturing at the crowd. "We've been wanting to strike for weeks, but the boss has threatened us. Easier to walk out when there are 10,000 people in the streets." "What do you want?" I asked. "What are we marching for?" He laughed. "Everything. Bread, peace, decent wages, an end to this goddamn war. Take your pick." We marched for hours, through the Viborg side, across the bridges, down the great boulevards of the city center. The police appeared periodically, small groups of them, looking overwhelmed and uncertain. They made no real effort to stop us. What could they do? We were too many, too angry, too determined. Near the Kazan Cathedral on Nevsky Prospect, we encountered a line of Cossacks. They sat on their horses in a line across the avenue, their fur hats dark against the gray sky, their faces impassive. The Cossacks were the Tsar's men, feared and hated in equal measure. When the government needed crowds dispersed, it sent the Cossacks. When it needed skulls cracked, it sent the Cossacks. They were not regular soldiers. They were instruments of terror. The march slowed, then stopped. We stood facing them, thousands of women and men and Cossacks and horses. The silence was heavy, tense. This was the moment that could tip either way, toward violence or toward something else. A young woman near the front, one of the textile workers I had stood with in the queue, stepped forward. She was small, maybe 19, her face set with determination. "Brothers," she called out, her voice carrying in the cold air. "We are your mothers, your sisters, your wives. We don't want trouble. We only want bread. Will you deny us that?" The lead Cossack, an officer with a thick beard and a face like weathered leather, stared down at her. His hand rested on the hilt of his saber. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he pulled his horse's reins and turned away. The other Cossacks followed. A roar went up from the crowd, triumph, disbelief, joy, all mixed together. The Cossacks had refused. The Tsar's own men had refused to stop us. I felt something shift inside me, something fundamental. We had power, real power, the kind that comes from numbers and unity and the simple refusal to be afraid anymore. We marched until evening, until the cold and exhaustion forced us to disperse. As the crowd broke up, drifting back to our neighborhoods, I walked home slowly. My feet ached. My throat was raw from shouting. But I felt more alive than I had in months. When I climbed the stairs to the apartment, I found Masha and Pyotr pressed against the window, watching the streets below, where small groups of people still milled about, talking excitedly. "Mama," Masha cried, "where were you? What's happening?" I pulled her close, then checked Pyotr. His fever was lower, not gone, but better. Small mercies. "Something is happening," I said. "I don't know what yet, but something." Grigory Ivanovich knocked and entered, his face flushed despite the cold, his eyes bright. "Did you see?" he asked. "Did you see how many of us there were?" I was there. "The factories are talking about a general strike. Every worker in Petrograd, the whole city, shut down until our demands are met." "What demands?" He laughed. "That's what we're arguing about. Some want higher wages, some want an end to the war. Some want the Tsar gone entirely. But everyone agrees on one thing: we can't go on like this. He was right. We couldn't. And now, finally, we were doing something about it. That night, I lay beside my children and listened to the city outside. There were voices in the streets, singing, shouting, celebrating. Somewhere, a factory whistle blew, though no one was working. The sound was picked up by another factory, then another, until the whole city seemed to be howling. I thought about Ivan, wherever he was, in his trench or billet or grave. Would he understand what was happening here? Would he approve? I didn't know. The war felt very far away now. What mattered was here, now, this moment when ordinary people like me had stepped into the streets and said, "Enough." I didn't sleep much that night. None of us did. The city was too loud, too alive, too full of possibility and danger. Tomorrow, I thought, everything might change. And I was right. February 24th to 26th, 1917. Friday began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a city holding its breath. The silence of factories that should have been roaring that stood idle. The silence of trams that should have been clattering along their tracks but sat empty at their terminals. The silence of a city that had stopped functioning and was waiting to see what would happen next. I woke at my usual time, 4 in the morning, out of habit more than necessity. There would be no bread queue today. There might be no bread at all. I lay in the darkness for a moment, listening. Pyotr was breathing easier, his fever broken overnight. Masha slept curled against him, one small hand resting on his shoulder. The apartment was cold. The stove had gone out sometime in the night, and we had no more coal to restart it. I rose quietly and went to the window. The street below was empty except for a patrol of soldiers walking in pairs, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their breath clouding white in the lamplight. They moved with caution, glancing at windows and doorways as though expecting ambush. They had the look of men who knew they were in hostile territory. Behind me, I heard Grigory Ivanovich moving in his room, the creak of floorboards, the scrape of a chair. A moment later, he knocked softly and entered the main room. He looked like he hadn't slept either. "There's talk of the Putilov workers marching again today," he said quietly. 30,000 of them, maybe more. The metal workers from the Vyborg side are planning to join them. They're saying it will be bigger than yesterday. "What does the government say?" He shrugged. "What can they say? They've posted notices declaring the strikes illegal, threatening arrests. But how do you arrest 30,000 people? How do you arrest an entire city?" We stood together at the window, watching the empty street. The sun was rising somewhere beyond the gray clouds, turning the sky from black to charcoal to a pale, sickly gray. "Elena Petrovna," Grigory said, "you should stay home today. Keep the children inside. There's going to be trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes when the government decides it's had enough of being ignored." I made the children breakfast, kasha again, thinner than usual because our supplies were running low. Masha ate hers without complaint, but Pyotr, still weak from his fever, only managed a few spoonfuls before pushing the bowl away. "Not hungry, little one?" He shook his head. "My throat hurts." I gave him more honey water, the very last of the honey, the jar scraped clean, and made him promise to rest. Then I did something I rarely did. I sat down. Not to work, not to cook, not to mend clothes or plan the day's survival. Just sat, my hands in my lap, and tried to think. What was happening? Yesterday we had marched for bread. Today the entire city seemed to be rising. Was this a revolution? The word felt too grand, too historical. Revolutions happened in books, in France a century ago, in distant countries with foreign names. Not here, not to us. But then, what else could you call it when workers abandoned their factories, when soldiers refused to fire on crowds, when the normal order of things simply stopped functioning? Around midday, against Grigory's advice and my own better judgment, I decided to go out. I had to see. I had to know what was happening. I told Masha to stay with Pyotr, to lock the door, to open it for no one except me or Grigory. She nodded, her face solemn, and I left. The streets were transformed. Where yesterday there had been marches, organized, purposeful, today there was chaos. Groups of people moved in all directions, some with clear destinations, others just wandering, caught up in the energy of the moment. Workers, students, housewives, children, everyone was outside, everyone was talking, everyone was part of whatever this was becoming. I walked toward Samsonevsky Prospect, where I could hear the sound of a crowd. When I turned the corner, I saw them. Thousands of people, maybe 10,000, filling the street from building to building. They carried red flags, dozens of them, hundreds of them, that snapped in the cold wind. The sight of so many red banners made my heart race. Red was the color of socialism, of revolution, of dangerous ideas that could get you arrested or worse. But there were no arrests happening. There were no police at all, at least none that I could see. I joined the edge of the crowd and let myself be carried along. We were moving toward the city center, toward Nevsky Prospect again. People around me were shouting slogans. Down with the autocracy! Down with the war! Bread, peace, and freedom! A woman beside me, old enough to be my mother, with a kerchief tied under her chin and eyes that had seen too much, grabbed my arm. "Are you coming to Nevsky?" she asked. "I suppose so." "Good. There are soldiers there. We need to show them we're not afraid." We crossed the Litani Bridge in a great mass, the crowd so dense that I could not have turned back if I wanted to. The bridge swayed slightly under our weight, thousands of people, all moving together, all sharing the same momentum. Below us, the Neva lay frozen and white, indifferent to human drama. On the other side, we poured into the streets of the city center. Here the buildings were grander, stone facades instead of brick, wide sidewalks, ornate lampposts. This was where the wealthy lived, where government offices stood, where power resided. And now we were flooding into it like a river overflowing its banks. Near the Kazan Cathedral, we encountered the first real resistance. A line of soldiers blocked the avenue, not Cossacks this time, but regular infantry. Young men, most of them, conscripts from villages and small towns, dressed in gray greatcoats and carrying rifles with fixed bayonets. They stood in formation, 3 rows deep, blocking the way forward. An officer stood in front of them, a lieutenant by the insignia on his shoulder. He was young, too, no more than 25, and his face was pale with fear or cold or both. "Disperse!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "You are violating martial law! Disperse immediately or we will be forced to take action!" The crowd slowed but did not stop. We pressed forward, not aggressively, but inexorably, like water flowing around a rock. "We want bread!" someone shouted. "We want peace! We want the war to end!" The lieutenant raised his hand, and the soldiers brought their rifles up to firing position. The crowd stopped. For a moment, everything hung in balance. I could see the faces of the soldiers, boys, really, barely older than children. They looked terrified. Then a woman stepped forward from the crowd. She was older, perhaps 60, wearing a shabby coat and a shawl that had been mended a dozen times. She walked directly toward the line of soldiers, slowly, her hands open and empty. "Sons," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "Do you know what day it is?" No one answered. "It's my grandson's birthday. He's 5 years old. His father, my son, died at Tannenberg. His mother works 16 hours a day at the textile mill and still can't afford to feed him properly. Today I went to 5 bakeries looking for bread to make him a birthday cake. 5 bakeries, all empty." She stopped a few feet from the soldiers, looking at them one by one. "I am not your enemy," she said. "These people are not your enemy. We are your mothers, your grandmothers. We only want to live. Will you shoot us for that?" The silence stretched. The lieutenant's hand trembled where it rested on his pistol holster. The soldiers stood like statues, their rifles still raised, but I could see doubt in their faces. Then one of them, a boy in the front row with a thin face and frightened eyes, lowered his rifle. Just slightly, just enough to notice. The officer saw it. "Hold your position," he barked. The boy raised his rifle again, but the moment had passed. The spell was broken. Another soldier lowered his weapon. Then another. "Hold your positions!" the lieutenant screamed. "That's an order!" But the soldiers were melting away, stepping back, breaking formation. They didn't run. They didn't join us. They just stopped. Stopped obeying. Stopped being instruments of authority. The crowd surged forward, not violently but triumphantly, and the soldiers let us pass. Some of them even smiled, small, guilty smiles, but smiles nonetheless. We marched down Nevsky Prospect in a great river of humanity. I lost track of time. An hour passed, maybe 2. The crowd swelled with each block as more people joined us. I saw well-dressed women marching alongside factory workers. I saw students linking arms with old men. I saw a priest in his black robes, his cross swinging as he walked, his face set with determination. Near the Admiralty, we encountered another military unit, this time a company of the Pavlovsky Regiment, one of the elite guards units that protected the Tsar and the royal family. They stood in ranks before the Winter Palace, their uniforms crisp, their bearing professional. These were not frightened conscripts. These were career soldiers. The crowd slowed, uncertain. The Pavlovsky Guards had a reputation for loyalty and ruthlessness. A captain stepped forward, an older man with a gray mustache and medals on his chest. He looked at us with an expression I could not read. "You will disperse," he said. "This is your final warning." No one moved. The captain's hand moved to his holster. Behind him, the guards raised their rifles in perfect synchronization. This is where people die, I thought. This is where it ends. But then a voice called out from the ranks of soldiers. "No!" The captain spun around. One of his own men, a sergeant by his stripes, had stepped forward. "I won't shoot women and old men," the sergeant said loudly. "Not for the Tsar, not for anyone." "You will follow orders or face a court-martial," the captain shouted. "Then court-martial me." Another soldier stepped forward, then another. Within moments, half the company had broken ranks. The captain stood alone, his face red with fury and humiliation. "You're all traitors!" he screamed. "Traitors to the Tsar! To Russia!" One of the soldiers, a young man, barely 20, spoke up. "No, sir. We're loyal to Russia. That's why we won't shoot Russians." The captain stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The soldiers who remained, those who had mutinied, began pulling off their imperial insignia and tying red cloths around their arms. The crowd erupted in cheers. I found myself cheering too, my voice hoarse, my heart pounding. The army was breaking. The Tsar's own guards were refusing orders. Nothing could stop this now. I stayed until evening, until the cold drove most people home. As the crowd dispersed, I walked back toward the Viborg side in a daze. The streets were littered with debris, torn posters, broken glass, abandoned equipment. Buildings were draped with red flags. Bonfires burned at intersections. Groups of workers and soldiers gathered around them, talking, arguing, planning. When I reached my building, I found Grigory Ivanovich in the courtyard with a group of neighbors. They were listening to a man I didn't recognize, a worker from the Putilov plant by his clothes, who was explaining something with animated gestures. "The Soviet is meeting tonight," the man was saying. "At the Taurid Palace. Every factory is sending representatives. Every regiment. We're forming a workers' government." "What about the Tsar's government?" someone asked. The man spat. "What government? The ministers have fled. The police have disappeared. The Duma is trying to assert authority, but no one's listening to them. The real power is with the Soviet now." I climbed the stairs to my apartment, my legs shaking with exhaustion. Masha opened the door before I could knock, her face flooded with relief. "Mama, we heard gunfire. We were so worried." "I'm fine, little dove. I'm fine." Pyotr was sitting up in bed, looking better, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Mama, Masha said there's a revolution. Is it true?" I looked at my children, my daughter with her serious face, my son with his feverish energy, and tried to find words to explain what I barely understood myself. "Yes," I said finally. "I think it is." That night the gunfire was constant. Not the organized volleys of military combat, but sporadic shots echoing through the streets. Warning shots, celebratory shots, the sound of a city arming itself. I heard later that arsenals had been raided, that thousands of rifles had been distributed to workers' militias, that the Peter and Paul fortress, the great prison where political dissidents were kept, had been stormed and its prisoners freed. I lay awake, listening to history unfold outside my window. Somewhere out there, the old world was dying, and something new, something terrifying and exhilarating and unknown, was being born. Saturday was worse, or better. I still don't know which. The government tried to reassert control. Troops were brought in from outside the city, reliable units, they thought, men who hadn't been contaminated by the revolutionary fervor of the capital. Machine guns appeared on rooftops. Armored cars rolled through the streets. Posters went up declaring martial law, threatening death for anyone who continued to strike or demonstrate. But it was too late. The workers didn't return to their factories. The crowds didn't disperse. And most crucially, more and more soldiers were joining the uprising instead of suppressing it. I kept the children inside that day, as Grigory had advised. We heard gunfire throughout the morning, sustained bursts that spoke of real fighting, not just warning shots. Smoke rose from somewhere near the Znamenskaya Square. Rumors flew through the building. The police were firing on crowds, workers had seized the telephone exchange, the Volhynian regiment had mutinied and killed its officers. Late in the afternoon, Grigory came home with news. His face was flushed, his hands shaking. "It's happening," he said. The regiments are going over. Volhynian, Preobrazhensky, Witovsky, they've all mutinied. They're marching to the Taurid Palace to declare their loyalty to the Soviet. How many? I asked. Tens of thousands, maybe the whole garrison. The Tsar's authority in Petrograd is finished. He paused, catching his breath. There was fighting at the Znamenskaya Square. The police set up machine guns and opened fire on the crowd. Dozens killed. But then the Volhynian regiment arrived and turned their rifles on the police. It was a massacre. The police are gone now. Dead, fled, hiding. The city belongs to the people. That night, the sky glowed orange. Buildings were burning, police stations, government offices, symbols of the old regime. From my window, I could see fires scattered across the city like fallen stars. Masha stood beside me, watching. "Is Papa's Tsar gone?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I think so." "Is that good?" I didn't know how to answer. Was it good? The Tsar, Nicholas II, little father, emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, had ruled my entire life. My parents had lived under him, my grandparents. For 300 years, the Romanovs had been Russia. And now, in the span of 4 days, that world had ended. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But it's done." Sunday, the killing stopped. The soldiers who had mutinied now controlled the city. They set up posts at key intersections, not to suppress the people, but to maintain order. Workers' militias patrolled the neighborhoods, wearing red armbands and carrying rifles. The police had vanished entirely, killed, arrested, or hiding in civilian clothes. I ventured out in the morning, leaving Masha to watch Pyotr again. The streets were calmer than the previous days, but the transformation was complete. Red flags hung from every building. The walls were plastered with proclamations and manifestos. Groups of people stood on corners, arguing about what should happen next. I walked to the Taurid Palace, drawn by curiosity and something deeper, a need to witness, to be part of this moment. The palace stood behind its iron gates, a massive neoclassical building that had once housed the Duma, the Tsar's rubber-stamp parliament. Now it was the center of 2 competing powers. In one wing, the Duma's Provisional Committee was meeting, moderate politicians and liberals trying to form a new government. In the other wing, the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies was convening, representatives elected by factories and regiments, arguing about socialism and revolution. I couldn't get inside. The crowds were too dense. But I stood outside and listened to speakers addressing the masses. "Comrades, the autocracy is finished. Now we must build a new Russia, a democratic Russia, a free Russia. The provisional government wants to continue the war, but we say peace without annexations or indemnities. All power to the Soviets." The arguments were fierce, passionate, sometimes incomprehensible. I didn't understand all the political terminology, the references to parties and programs and ideologies. But I understood the energy, the sense that anything was possible now. I stayed for hours, until my feet ached and my hands were numb with cold. Then I walked home through a city that looked the same buildings, the same streets, the same gray sky, but felt utterly different. When I reached the apartment, I found Klavdia from the mill waiting in the courtyard. She grabbed my hands, her face alight with joy. "Elena, have you heard? The workers at our mill have elected a factory committee. We're taking control, setting our own hours, our own wages. No more Kuskov. No more bosses telling us what to do." "What about production?" I asked. She waved a hand dismissively. "We'll figure it out. The point is,
We're in charge now. Us, the workers.
I wanted to share her enthusiasm, but doubt nagged at me. Who would buy our textiles if there was no system to sell them? Who would supply the raw materials? Who would... But Claudia was already rushing off to another meeting, another discussion, another piece of the revolution being built in real time. That night, I sat with Grigori at the kitchen table. The children were asleep. Outside, the city was quieter than it had been in days, though still far from silent. "What happens now?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his tea. "I don't know," he said finally. "The Tsar is still at the front. They're negotiating with him by telegraph. The Duma wants him to appoint a constitutional government, to share power. But the Soviet wants him gone entirely. And the soldiers..." He shook his head. "The soldiers won't fight for him anymore. Some of them want him arrested. Some want him dead." "Will he abdicate?" "He might have to. What choice does he have? He's lost his army, lost his capital, lost everything." We sat in silence, contemplating the impossible thing that had happened. A revolution. A real revolution. Not in the history books, not in some distant country, but here, now, to us. "Elena Petrovna," Grigori said quietly, "do you think it will last, this freedom?" It was the same question I had been asking myself. "I don't know," I said, "but for now, it's ours." Outside, somewhere in the darkness, someone was singing the Marseillaise, the French revolutionary anthem that had become the song of our own revolution. Other voices joined in until the whole street seemed to be singing. I thought of Ivan, wherever he was. Would he hear about this? Would he understand what had happened? Would he come home to a different Russia? I thought of my children asleep in the next room. What kind of world would they grow up in? Better than this one, I hoped. It could hardly be worse. I thought of the Tsar, 300 miles away, receiving telegrams telling him that his empire had collapsed, that his soldiers had mutinied, that his capital was in the hands of workers and rebels. And I thought of myself, Elena Sokolova, seamstress, mother, nobody in particular, who had stood in a bread queue 4 days ago and was now part of a revolution. The world had turned upside down. And tomorrow, we would have to figure out what that meant. February 27th to March 2nd, 1917. Monday morning, February 27th, the Russian Empire ceased to exist. I learned this not from newspapers. There were newspapers again, dozens of them, new ones appearing every hour with wild headlines and wilder claims, but from a soldier who came to our building looking for food. He was young, no more than 20, still wearing his Imperial Army uniform, but with a red armband tied around his sleeve. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his face was smudged with soot and exhaustion. He stood in our courtyard, surrounded by a small crowd of neighbors, and told us what had happened overnight. "The arsenal on Liteyny Prospect has been taken," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting or smoke or both. "We stormed it at dawn. 40,000 rifles, ammunition, everything. It's all being distributed to the workers' militias now." He paused to catch his breath. "Kresty prison has been opened. All the political prisoners are free, socialists, revolutionaries, everyone they locked up for opposing the war or the Tsar." "What about the government?" someone asked. The Tsar's ministers. The soldier laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. In prison themselves now. We arrested them last night. Protopopov, Sheglovitov, the whole lot. They're in the Peter and Paul fortress, the same cells they used to throw us in. The crowd murmured, shock, satisfaction, disbelief mixed together. So who's in charge? Old Madame Kuznetsova asked. She had finally emerged from her apartment, leaning on a cane, her face gray with age and hunger. The soldier shrugged. The Duma says they are. They formed the Provisional Committee, but the Soviet is meeting at the same time, issuing their own orders. Everyone is arguing about who has authority. He smiled slightly. No one knows. Maybe that's better. He asked if anyone could spare food. I had almost nothing. Our supplies were nearly exhausted. But I gave him a piece of black bread, hard and stale, but still edible. He thanked me with genuine gratitude and moved on to the next building. After he left, the neighbors stood in the courtyard, talking in low voices. The mood was strange, triumphant but uncertain, like people who had won a victory but didn't quite understand what they had won. Grigori appeared beside me. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, which he probably hadn't. I was at the Taurid Palace last night, he said. The Soviet elected an executive committee. Chkedze is chairman. They're calling it the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies. He rubbed his eyes. There must have been 2,000 people in that hall, all shouting at once. Every factory sent delegates, every regiment. Complete chaos, but... He paused, searching for words. But beautiful chaos. Democratic chaos. What did they decide? Everything and nothing. They passed a resolution demanding an end to the war. They declared support for the provisional government, but only insofar as it carries out the will of the people. They argued about whether to push for socialism immediately or wait. Some wanted armed uprising, some wanted careful negotiation. He smiled wearily. Welcome to democracy. I spent that day in a kind of fog, moving through the apartment, preparing thin soup from what little remained of our food, listening to the sounds of the city transforming outside. There was still gunfire, but sporadic now, isolated shots, not sustained combat. The fighting was winding down because there was no one left to fight. The old regime had simply collapsed. Its officials fled or arrested, its police force evaporated, its army in mutiny. Late in the afternoon, Klavdia arrived at my door, breathless and excited. Elena, there's a meeting at the mill tonight. All workers are invited. We're going to elect our own Soviet, our own committee to run the factory. You have to come. I can't leave the children. Bring them. Everyone's bringing their families. This is history, Elena. You can't miss it. So I went, bundling Masha and Pyotr in every warm thing we owned, walking through streets that were still strange and new. The mill loomed ahead, its windows lit for the first time in days. Usually the sight of the mill filled me with dread. It meant work, exhaustion, exploitation. Tonight it looked almost welcoming. The meeting was held in the main production hall, where the looms normally stood. Someone had pushed the machines aside to create a space, and hundreds of workers had gathered. Textile workers like me, mechanics, foremen, even some of the former managers looking uncertain and diminished. A platform had been erected at one end, and various people climbed up to speak. Some I knew by sight, other workers, union organizers. Some were strangers, socialists and revolutionaries who had been in prison or exile and were now free. One speaker, a woman named Vera Karolina, who had worked at the mill for 20 years, stood before us with tears streaming down her face. "Comrades," she said, her voice breaking, "I never thought I would live to see this day. For 20 years, I have worked 12-hour shifts for starvation wages. For 20 years, I have watched my fellow workers sicken and die from the dust and the conditions. For 20 years, I have been told to be grateful for the privilege of making rich men richer." She wiped her eyes. "That ends now. We are taking control of our own labor. We will set our own hours, our own wages, our own conditions. We are free." The hall erupted in applause. I found myself clapping too, caught up in the emotion of the moment. We voted on everything that night. 8-hour workday, passed unanimously. Wage increase, passed. Factory committee with elected representatives, passed. The right to remove abusive foremen, passed with vengeful enthusiasm. Kuskov, our old supervisor, stood against the back wall, his face red with humiliation and rage. When someone proposed that he be removed from his position, he tried to speak in his own defense, but he was shouted down. Democracy, I discovered, could be cruel as well as just. I didn't speak during the meeting. I had nothing eloquent to say. But when it came time to vote, I raised my hand with everyone else. For the first time in my life, I had a voice in decisions that affected my labor, my livelihood, my future. It was intoxicating. We left the mill after midnight, walking home through streets lit by bonfires and celebration. Masha and Pyotr were exhausted but too excited to complain. Everywhere we looked, people were gathered in groups, talking, singing, reading aloud from newspapers and proclamations. On the corner of Samsonevsky and Bolshoi, someone had set up a barrel as a speaker's platform. A young man, a student by his clothes, stood on it, reading from a newspaper. "Bulletin from General Headquarters," he read. "His Imperial Majesty has departed the front and is returning to Tsarskoye Selo to address the crisis in the capital." He looked up from the paper. "The Tsar is coming back! Let him come! We'll show him what we think of his authority!" The crowd cheered. I felt a shiver run through me, not fear exactly, but something close to it. The Tsar. For my entire life he had been an absolute ruler, a figure whose authority was divine and unquestionable. The idea of him returning to face his rebellious capital was both thrilling and terrifying. When we reached home, I put the children to bed and sat with Grigory at the kitchen table. He had brought home a newspaper, one of the new ones, printed that afternoon on cheap paper with smeared ink. The headline read, "Long live free Russia." "They're saying the Tsar's train was stopped," Grigory said, reading from the paper. "The railway workers refused to let it through. He's stranded at Pskov." "They stopped the Tsar's train?" He nodded. "Railway workers. Ordinary men. They just refused. Said they wouldn't transport him until he agreed to reforms." He laughed in disbelief. "Can you imagine? A month ago that would have been treason punishable by death. Now it's just Tuesday." Over the next 2 days the news trickled in, each piece more astonishing than the last. The Tsar was isolated at Pskov, his train surrounded by mutinous troops. The Duma had sent representatives to negotiate with him. The Soviet had sent their own delegation. Telegrams flew back and forth. The Tsar offered concessions, a constitutional government, democratic reforms, ministerial responsibility to the Duma. But it was too late for concessions. The dam had broken. On March 1st, I went to the market for the first time in a week. The situation there was slightly better, not good, but better. Some vendors had returned, bringing what supplies they could. The prices were still absurd, but at least there was food to buy. I purchased potatoes, onions, and a small piece of salt pork with the last of my savings. On the way home, I saw a crowd gathered around a newspaper kiosk. People were pushing and shouting, trying to get copies of the latest edition. I joined the crowd and managed to grab a paper. The headline read, "The Tsar abdicates." I read the words 3 times before they penetrated. The Tsar abdicates. Nicholas II, emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, defender of the Orthodox faith, ruler by divine right, had given up the throne. The article gave details. Yesterday, March 2nd, at Pskov, the Tsar had signed the act of abdication. He had renounced the throne not just for himself, but for his son as well, passing the crown to his brother, Grand Duke Michael. But Michael had refused it, saying he would only accept if offered by a constituent assembly elected by the people. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years of unbroken rule, was finished. I stood in the street clutching the newspaper, unable to move. Around me, people were crying, cheering, embracing. An old man fell to his knees and crossed himself. A young woman climbed onto a lamppost and began singing the Marseillaise. I walked home in a daze. When I reached the apartment, Masha was at the window watching the celebrations in the street. "Mama, what's happening?" she asked. I showed her the newspaper, though she couldn't read well enough to understand it. "The Tsar is gone," I said. "There is no Tsar anymore." "Will Papa come home now?" The question pierced me. Would he? Would any of them, the millions of men at the front, dying in trenches for a Tsar who no longer existed? I don't know, little dove. That evening, all of Petrograd celebrated. Bonfires blazed in every square. People danced in the streets. Bottles appeared from hiding places, vodka, wine, beer, and were shared freely. Strangers embraced, enemies reconciled. For one night, the entire city was united in joy and triumph. I took the children down to the courtyard where our neighbors had gathered. Someone had brought an accordion, and people were dancing, clumsy, joyful dances, everyone stumbling over each other and laughing. Old Madame Kuznetsova sat on a bench, watching with tears streaming down her face. "I never thought I'd see it," she kept saying. "Never thought I'd live to see the Tsar fall." Grigory stood beside me, watching the celebration. "It's the end of an era," he said quietly. "Is it the beginning of a better one?" He looked at me, his face serious. "I don't know, but it's the beginning of something." Someone thrust a tin cup into my hand, vodka, harsh and burning. I drank it down, feeling the warmth spread through me. Masha and Pyotr ran in circles with the other children, shrieking with laughter, their faces flushed. I looked up at the sky. It was clear for the first time in weeks, the stars visible between the buildings. The same stars that had looked down on the Romanovs for 3 centuries. The same stars that would look down on whatever came next. We had done the impossible. We, ordinary people, workers and mothers and soldiers, had overthrown an empire. We had brought down a dynasty that had seemed as permanent as the ground beneath our feet. And now we would have to build something new. I didn't know if we were ready for that. I didn't know if anyone was. But we had no choice. The old world was gone. We would have to create the new one. Later that night, after the celebrations had wound down and the children were asleep, I sat at the window one last time. The city was quieter now, the fires burning low, but still I could hear voices in the distance, singing, talking, celebrating. I thought about everything that had happened. 10 days ago, I had been standing in a bread queue, cold and hungry and hopeless. Now I had witnessed a revolution, had participated in it, had helped make it happen. What came next would be difficult, I knew that. The war was still raging, food was still scarce, winter was far from over. The provisional government and the Soviet were already arguing about who had authority, what reforms to implement, whether to continue the war or seek peace. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, we had won. We were free. And that was enough. March 3rd to 15th, 1917. The days after the Tsar's abdication were strange, suspended between the world that had ended and the world that had not yet begun. I woke on March 3rd to an unfamiliar sound: silence. Not the tense silence of the previous week, when the city had held its breath, waiting for violence. Real silence. The kind that comes when people are too exhausted to fight anymore, when the adrenaline has worn off and the reality of what has happened begins to sink in. The children slept late, which was unusual. Pyotr's fever had finally broken completely, and he was recovering his energy day by day. Masha had dark circles under her eyes from too many late nights and too much excitement. I let them sleep and sat by the window, watching the street come slowly to life. The red flags were still there, hanging from windows and lampposts, but the crowds were gone. The barricades that had been thrown up during the fighting were being dismantled. Workers in civilian clothes were clearing debris from the streets, sweeping up broken glass, removing bullet-scarred posters from walls. Life, in its mundane way, was trying to resume. Grigory knocked and entered, carrying a newspaper and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Bread," he said, placing the bundle on the table. "Real bread. The bakery on Bolshoi opened this morning. The line was manageable." I unwrapped it. 2 loaves, dark and dense but fresh. The smell made my mouth water. "How did you pay for this?" I asked. Bread had been unaffordable for weeks. "The provisional government is subsidizing bakeries. Price controls. They're trying to prevent starvation." He sat down heavily. "Whether it will work is another question." We cut the bread carefully, rationing it out. I woke the children and gave them each a thick slice with a scraping of butter that Grigory had somehow acquired. Watching them eat, really eat, not just nibble at thin kasha, made my throat tight with emotion. "The provisional government has announced its program," Grigory said, opening the newspaper. "Political amnesty, freedom of speech and press, equality before the law regardless of class or religion. Preparations for a constituent assembly to determine Russia's future government." He looked up. "Prince Lvov is the prime minister. Kerensky, the socialist from the Duma, is minister of justice." "What about the war?" His face darkened. "They're continuing it. Russia will fulfill her obligations to her allies. That's the official line." "The soldiers won't accept that." "I know. The Soviet knows. Everyone knows, except the provisional government, apparently." He folded the newspaper. "There's going to be another crisis. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon." I wanted to argue, to say that surely we had earned some peace, some stability. But I knew he was right. The revolution had not resolved the questions that had caused it. We still had no food security. We were still at war. The provisional government was full of liberal aristocrats and moderate politicians who had never worked a factory floor or stood in a bread queue. And the Soviet, representing workers and soldiers, was growing stronger every day. 2 powers, both claiming legitimacy, both issuing orders. It couldn't last. But for now, we had bread. That was something. Over the next week, the city settled into a new routine. The factories reopened, most of them, at least. Workers returned to their jobs, though now we worked under the supervision of elected factory committees rather than appointed bosses. The 8-hour day was implemented. Wages were raised. It felt like victory. The mill was transformed. Kuskov was gone, removed by vote and escorted from the premises by a workers' militia. A new supervisor had been elected from among the workers themselves, a woman named Anna Dmitrievna, who had worked the looms for 15 years and commanded respect through competence rather than fear. Production was chaotic at first. Without the old hierarchies, people argued about everything: who should work which shift, how materials should be distributed, whether we should prioritize military contracts or civilian goods. The meetings were endless and exhausting, but there was something exhilarating about them too. We were learning in real time how to govern ourselves. Klavdia threw herself into the work with revolutionary fervor. She attended every meeting, spoke at every opportunity, pushed for more radical reforms. "This is just the beginning," she told me during a break one afternoon. "We've won political freedom, but we still don't control the means of production. The factory owners still profit from our labor. That needs to change." "What do you propose?" "Nationalization. The state should own the factories, or better yet, the workers should own them directly. Each factory a collective, run democratically, with profits shared equally." It sounded utopian, impossible. But then, a month ago, the idea of overthrowing the Tsar had sounded impossible too. "One step at a time," I said. She smiled. "That's what they always say. But revolutions don't wait for permission." I thought about that conversation often in the days that followed. Was the revolution over, or was it just beginning? Had we achieved our goals, or were they still ahead of us? The question became more urgent as the political situation grew more complex. The provisional government, led by Prince Lvov and staffed largely by liberals and moderates from the old Duma, was trying to establish legitimacy and order. They issued proclamations, appointed ministers, promised reforms. On paper, they governed Russia, but in practice, power was increasingly flowing to the Soviets. The Petrograd Soviet, meeting daily in the Tauride Palace, had become the real authority for workers and soldiers. When the Soviet issued an order, people obeyed. When the provisional government issued an order, people debated whether to obey. The situation was summarized by a phrase I heard repeatedly: dual power. Two governments, two centers of authority, both claiming to represent the revolution. Over the next week, the city settled into a new routine. The factories reopened, most of them at least. Workers returned to their jobs, though now we worked under the supervision of elected factory committees rather than appointed bosses. The 8-hour day was implemented. Wages were raised. It felt like victory. The mill was transformed. Kuskov was gone, removed by vote and escorted from the premises by a workers' militia. A new supervisor had been elected from among the workers themselves, a woman named Anna Dmitrievna, who had worked the looms for 15 years and commanded respect through competence rather than fear. Production was chaotic at first. Without the old hierarchies, people argued about everything: who should work which shift, how materials should be distributed, whether we should prioritize military contracts or civilian goods. The meetings were endless and exhausting, but there was something exhilarating about them too. We were learning in real time how to govern ourselves. Klavdia threw herself into the work with revolutionary fervor. She attended every meeting, spoke at every opportunity, pushed for more radical reforms. "This is just the beginning," she told me during a break one afternoon. We've won political freedom, but we still don't control the means of production. The factory owners still profit from our labor. That needs to change. What do you propose? Nationalization. The state should own the factories, or better yet, the workers should own them directly. Each factory a collective, run democratically, with profits shared equally. It sounded utopian, impossible. But then, a month ago, the idea of overthrowing the Tsar had sounded impossible too. One step at a time, I said. She smiled. That's what they always say, but revolutions don't wait for permission. I thought about that conversation often in the days that followed. Was the revolution over, or was it just beginning? Had we achieved our goals, or were they still ahead of us? The question became more urgent as the political situation grew more complex. The provisional government, led by Prince Lvov and staffed largely by liberals and moderates from the old Duma, was trying to establish legitimacy and order. They issued proclamations, appointed ministers, promised reforms. On paper, they governed Russia, but in practice, power was increasingly flowing to the Soviets. The Petrograd Soviet, meeting daily in the Tauride Palace, had become the real authority for workers and soldiers. When the Soviet issued an order, people obeyed. When the provisional government issued an order, people debated whether to obey. The situation was summarized by a phrase I heard repeatedly: dual power. Two governments, two centers of authority, both claiming to represent the revolution. The next day, I went to the Tauride Palace. I had to see for myself what was happening, had to understand the forces that would determine our future. The palace was chaos. In one wing, the provisional government held formal meetings with parliamentary procedure and recorded minutes. In the other wing, the Soviet met in a vast hall, packed with delegates from factories and regiments, everyone shouting at once, democracy as spectacle and noise. I couldn't get into either meeting, the crowds were too dense, but I stood in the corridors and listened to speakers addressing impromptu gatherings. The provisional government wants to continue the imperialist war, but we, the workers and soldiers, demand peace. We must be careful not to push too far too fast. The bourgeois revolution must precede the socialist revolution. These things have stages. Stages? Our children are starving now, not in stages. We need action, not theory. The arguments were fierce, passionate, sometimes incomprehensible. I recognized few of the speakers, though some names were becoming familiar. Kerensky, Chaitse, Tsereteli. And one name I heard repeatedly, though I never saw the man himself: Lenin, a Bolshevik leader in exile, reportedly trying to return to Russia. I left the palace more confused than when I arrived. Who was right? The moderates who counseled patience, or the radicals who demanded immediate transformation? Should we work with the provisional government, or should we push for Soviet power? Should we honor our commitments to the Allies, or should we seek peace at any cost? I didn't know. I didn't have the education or the theoretical understanding to navigate these questions. I was just a seamstress, a mother, trying to survive in a world that was changing faster than I could comprehend. But I knew this: we had broken something vast and old when we overthrew the Tsar, and now we would have to live with the consequences of that breaking, for good or ill. On March 15th, 2 weeks after the abdication, I walked to the market with Masha. Spring was definitely coming now. The snow was melting, revealing the filth beneath, but also hints of green. The air smelled different, less harsh. The market was better stocked than it had been in months. Not prosperous, not abundant, but functional. We bought potatoes, cabbage, a bit of fish. The prices were still high, but not impossibly so. On the way home, we passed a group of soldiers sitting on a curb, smoking cigarettes and talking. One of them called out, "Comrade, have you heard the news? The emperor, the former emperor, and his family have been arrested. They're being held at Tsarskoye Selo under guard." I stopped. Arrested? He nodded. The provisional government doesn't trust him not to try to reclaim the throne, so they're keeping him locked up. Ironic, isn't it? The Tsar, a prisoner in his own palace. I walked on, thinking about that. Nicholas Romanov, who had ruled an empire, was now a prisoner. His wife, his children, all under guard, their future uncertain. I should have felt satisfaction, revenge even. This was the man who had sent millions to die in a pointless war, who had ignored our suffering, who had ruled with divine authority and callous indifference. But I felt only pity. He was a man, after all, a father, and he had lost everything. That night I told Masha and Pyotr a story. Not the fairy tales I usually told, but something closer to truth. Once, I said, there was a great empire ruled by a Tsar who lived in a beautiful palace. The Tsar thought his power would last forever. But the people were hungry and tired and sad. So one day they stood up and said, "Enough," and the Tsar fell. "Is that a true story, Mama?" Masha asked. "Yes." "What happened after the Tsar fell?" I paused, considering. "I don't know yet. The story isn't finished." "Will it have a happy ending?" I looked at my children, their serious faces, their hope, their trust that I could protect them and explain the world. "I hope so, little dove. I hope so." But hope, I was learning, was not the same as certainty. Late March, 1917. Spring arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as though uncertain of its welcome. The ice on the Neva began to crack, not all at once, but in slow fractures that spread across the frozen surface like fault lines. Dark water appeared in the gaps, promising movement after months of stillness. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time since October. Icicles dripped from roof lines, creating small rivers in the gutters. The days grew longer. Dawn came earlier, dusk later. Light, actual sunlight, weak but real, began to penetrate the gray that had dominated our sky all winter. Petrograd exhaled. Life tried to resume its rhythms. The markets opened fully, with something approaching their former selection. The trams ran on predictable schedules. People went to work, came home, cooked dinner, slept. Children played in the streets, their voices echoing in courtyards that had been silent all winter. Old women sat on benches in small parks, faces turned toward the sun like flowers. On the surface, it looked almost normal. But everything had changed. I returned to my routine at the mill, though the work felt fundamentally different now. We still operated the looms, still produced fabric for uniforms and bandages and civilian clothes. But the atmosphere had transformed. The overseers no longer barked orders from positions of unquestioned authority. The foreman, Anna Dmitrievna now, elected by us, walked the floor with purpose but without intimidation. We worked, yes, but we also talked. We debated production schedules, argued about shift assignments, questioned decisions that once would have been handed down from above without explanation. The factory committee met every Thursday evening in what had been the manager's conference room. 20 workers, elected by their departments, gathering around a table that had once been reserved for owners and executives. I had been elected as one of the representatives from the textile floor, though I still wasn't sure why. I barely spoke at the meetings, overwhelmed by the complexity of running a factory. Claudia, by contrast, had thrown herself completely into the work of revolutionary reconstruction. She spoke at every meeting, proposed resolutions, argued with passionate conviction for more radical reforms. She wanted worker ownership, profit sharing, the complete elimination of the old hierarchies. Her energy was exhausting but inspiring. "We can't just replicate the old system with new faces," she said at one meeting. "The revolution isn't about replacing one boss with another, it's about eliminating bosses entirely." Some workers agreed enthusiastically. Others looked skeptical, not opposed to the idea exactly, but uncertain how it would work in practice. Who would make final decisions? Who would coordinate with suppliers and buyers? Who would maintain discipline when production fell behind? These were not theoretical questions. Every day brought new challenges. Shortages of raw materials because the railways were still disrupted. Confusion about orders because the old commercial networks had collapsed. Disputes between workers about fair distribution of the hardest and easiest jobs. Democracy, I discovered, was messy. It was slow. It required endless conversation, endless compromise. But it was ours. That mattered. One afternoon in late March, I was working my loom when Anna Dmitrievna approached with a young man I didn't recognize. He was thin, pale, with the look of someone who had been sick or imprisoned, or both. "Elena Petrovna," Anna said. "This is Mikhail Antonovich. He's just returned from exile in Siberia. Political prisoner, arrested for organizing a strike in 1914. He's looking for work, and I thought..." I looked at the young man. His hands were shaking slightly. His eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. "Can you work a loom?" I asked. "I can learn." "Then I'll teach you." For the next week, Mikhail worked beside me, learning the rhythm of the machine, the careful tension required to prevent thread breaks, the timing of the shuttle. He was a quick learner, and during our breaks he told me fragments of his story. The strike he had organized, the arrest at midnight, the journey in chains to a camp near Irkutsk, 3 years of labor in temperatures that made Petrograd's winter seem tropical. "I thought I would die there," he said one afternoon, his voice flat with memory. "Many did. But then word came. The Tsar had abdicated. Political prisoners were being amnestied. We walked out of the camp and started making our way west. It took 6 weeks to reach Petrograd." "What will you do now?" He shrugged. "Work, organize, help build the new Russia." He smiled slightly. "I didn't survive Siberia to watch the revolution be stolen by liberals and moderates." His words echoed conversations I heard everywhere. The revolution was not over, that much was clear. The question was, what came next? The provisional government, led by Prince Lvov and supported by moderate socialists, was trying to establish a functioning democracy. They were preparing for elections to a constituent assembly, creating new laws, negotiating with the Allies about the war. On paper, they governed Russia. But real power lay elsewhere. The Petrograd Soviet, growing in membership and confidence daily, was becoming the true voice of workers and soldiers. When the Soviet issued an order, people obeyed. When the provisional government issued an order, people asked, "What does the Soviet say?" This dual power, the phrase was everywhere now, could not last indefinitely. Eventually, one authority would have to prevail, or the conflict between them would tear the country apart. Grigori followed these developments with the attention of a man watching a slow-motion catastrophe. "The provisional government wants to continue the war," he explained one evening over tea. "They've promised Britain and France that Russia will keep fighting. But the soldiers are done. They're deserting by the thousands, just walking away from the front and heading home. Some units have elected committees to negotiate with their officers about whether to follow orders. Can't the government stop them? How? The army answers to the Soviet now, thanks to Order Number 1. And the Soviet is split. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries want to support the provisional government, at least for now. But the Bolsheviks..." He paused. "The Bolsheviks are calling for all power to the Soviets, for immediate peace, for workers' control of the factories. And their leader, Lenin, is on his way back from exile. Is that good or bad? Depends who you ask." The question felt urgent because the fragile stability we had achieved was already beginning to crack. Food shortages, though not as severe as February, persisted. The bread ration was inconsistent. Prices kept rising. The provisional government tried to impose price controls, but black markets flourished. Workers demanded higher wages to keep pace with inflation, and when wages rose, prices rose further. The spiral was unsustainable. The war, that endless, grinding war, continued to drain resources and lives. Every day, trains arrived at the Finland station carrying wounded soldiers, their bodies broken, their eyes empty. Every day, telegrams arrived announcing deaths at the front. The casualty lists were published in newspapers, column after column of names, each one someone's son or husband or father. And still the provisional government insisted, "We must honor our commitments, we must fight until victory." But what did victory even mean anymore? The war had lost whatever purpose it once had. We were fighting because we had been fighting, because stopping seemed harder than continuing, because no one knew how to end something so vast and destructive. I thought often of Ivan's letter, his description of soldiers simply walking away. Part of me hoped he would do the same, just leave the trenches and come home. But another part of me worried. What would become of an army in dissolution? Where would all those armed men go? What would they do? One evening in late March, I took the children for a walk along the embankment. The Neva was breaking up properly now, great sheets of ice drifting downstream, colliding and grinding against each other with sounds like distant thunder. People lined the railings to watch. It was a spectacle, the ice breakup, a sign that winter was truly ending. Pyotr tugged my hand. "Mama, will everything be better now?" It was the same question he had asked before, and I still didn't have a better answer. Different, certainly. Better, I hope so. Masha, more perceptive, asked, "Are you worried, Mama?" I looked down at her serious face. She was 8 years old, but had the eyes of someone older, someone who had seen too much already. "A little," I admitted. "Change is frightening, even when it's necessary." "But we made the change happen," she said. "You told me. You marched in the streets." "I did." "Then we can make it work, can't we?" I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the revolution we had made, ordinary people like me standing up and saying enough, would lead somewhere good, somewhere just, somewhere where children didn't go to bed hungry and mothers didn't stand in bread queues before dawn. But belief was getting harder. Around us, the city hummed with nervous energy. Soldiers on street corners, still wearing red armbands, argued about politics. Workers heading home from factories debated the latest Soviet resolutions. Students distributed pamphlets with passionate manifestos. Everyone had opinions. Everyone had plans for Russia's future. And I, Elena Sokolova, seamstress, mother, nobody in particular, stood by the river and watched the ice break and wondered what would come next. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Grigori. We had fallen into a comfortable routine, these evening conversations, sharing the day's news and worries over weak tea. "Do you think it will hold?" I asked. "This new order we've created?" He was quiet for a long time, staring into his tea as though it might contain answers. "Honestly, no. Not as it is. Dual power can't last. Eventually, the provisional government and the Soviet will clash, and one will have to yield or be crushed. And then—" he trailed off. "And then?" "And then we'll see if this was a revolution or just the prelude to one." His words stayed with me long after he had gone to bed. A prelude. That's what this was. The opening act of something larger, something still unfolding. I went to the window one last time, as had become my habit. The city spread below, quieter now in the late evening, but still alive with possibility and danger. We had overthrown a 300-year-old dynasty in a week. We had forced the Tsar to abdicate. We had created Soviets and factory committees and a revolutionary government. We had tasted freedom and power and the intoxicating belief that ordinary people could shape history. But we had not solved the fundamental problems that had driven us into the streets: hunger, war, inequality, exhaustion. Those remained pressing and urgent. And now new problems had emerged: political divisions, economic chaos, the question of who truly governed Russia, the uncertainty of what came next. I thought of Ivan, somewhere out there in the darkness, perhaps even now making his way home from a war that had lost all meaning. I thought of my children, sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware of the forces gathering around them. I thought of all the Elenas across Russia, ordinary women trying to keep their families alive in extraordinary times. What would we tell our children about these days? What story would we construct from the chaos we were living through? I didn't know yet. The story was still being written, and I was both author and character, observer and participant. One thing I knew with certainty: we had crossed a threshold. There was no going back to the old Russia, the Russia of the Tsar and unquestioned authority and grinding oppression. That world was gone, broken as completely as the ice on the Neva. What we would build in its place remained to be seen, but we would build something. We had to. The alternative, chaos, collapse, civil war, was too terrible to contemplate. So we would build and hope and struggle and argue and somehow, perhaps, create a new Russia from the ruins of the old. The revolution was not over. It had barely begun. And I, Elena Sokolova, survivor of the hunger winter, witness to the fall of the Tsar, participant in the birth of a new world, would be there to see what came next. Whatever it was, whatever it cost. We had come too far to turn back now.